Well, welcome all. Thanks to everyone for dialing in to today's session from all corners of the world today. We were delighted with the amount of people who registered both through the Ceres 2021 conference, but also this is a public community event. So thank you for being here. My name is Siobhan Collins, and I'm a senior manager on the Ceres Company Network team. And we're delighted to have you participate in this Ceres 2021 virtual conference workshop with our partners at Moody's. And for those of you who don't know, Moody's is both a member of our Ceres Company Network, but also our investor network on climate risk and sustainability. So you just got a teaser into that video of Moody's and their new ESG credit impact scores. But to give you a little bit more context, Moody's published an updated ESG cross-sector methodology this past December that introduced the new ESG issuer profile and credit impact scores for rated entities. And then back just in January, they published ESG scores for rated sovereigns. And as that video mentioned, through 2021, Moody's will expand to an increasing number of issuers, transactions across corporates, infrastructure, public finance, and financial institutions, many of you who are tuning in to the line today. So I'm joined here, as you can see on this slide, with two experts from the Moody's team. First, we'll hear from Swami, who's a senior vice president and manager in the Moody's ESG group. And he manages the development of ESG analytic tools, assessments, and the integration of ESG considerations into Moody's credit ratings and research. And then we'll hear from Gabriel, who's the vice president and senior credit officer in Moody's Sovereign Risk Group. He's going to spotlight what this means for sovereigns, walk through the methodology, scoring system, and also a handful of case studies. So throughout today's workshop, please don't hesitate to use the chat box function. I know if we were in person, we'd be around a table, certainly lots of hands going up in the room, but we'll have a dedicated portion at the end of the event to dig in more deeply. With that being said, Swami, let me hand things over to you.
Thank you, Siobhan. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to start off by saying that Gabriel and I, we will broadly walk you through the framework that we have recently introduced to create scores that speak to how ESG considerations are both integrated into credit as well as how they impact ratings. And while Gabriel will be speaking specifically with respect to sovereigns, the choice of sovereigns is because that's the only sector we have currently published scores for. But the methodology and the approach that adopted is a framework that's applicable to all other sectors as well. So what I'll do is I'll give you a sense for the framework, have Gabriel walk you through the scores in the case of sovereigns. We only have slides or presentation materials for about a half hour. And so that leaving plenty of time for questions. We would, however, like you to stop us, interrupt us with questions even as we go along. And in fact, I would probably stop along the way and ask if there are questions. I think it's a much better way to move forward. With that, I thought I would begin with an introduction to Moody's and ESG broadly, right? So Moody's has the credit rating agency, Moody's Investor Service. We also have Moody's Analytics, which is outside the rating agency. They offer a number of risk assessment and risk management, portfolio management solutions to customers. And then Moody's also has, in the last 2 years, acquired at least 2 different ESG-related data and analytics providers. One of them, Vigeo Eiris, was acquired in early 2019. They provide sustainability ratings as well as second-party opinions on green bonds and sustainable bonds and ESG indices. 427 was another data provider we acquired in late 2019, which provides more systematic data and scores on climate risk, physical risks of climate change to be more specific. We also have acquired another company called Sintao in China that provides ESG data and analytics for Chinese companies. And we did that sometime in 2020. What I wanted to say is Gabriel and I primarily speak to Moody's Investor Service, the rating agency, and how ESG is incorporated into credit ratings. We will, in the course of talking about it, sometimes refer to some of these other entities. Um, Data from these entities, especially Vigeo Iris and 427, is certainly available to us in the work that we do, but we do not directly manage, or my ESG team is specific to the rating agency, and we do not create the scores that these other entities may produce. Those are independent products created under their own methodology by these respective companies. So if you have questions on those, by all means ask us, but there may be some, I'll be able to speak to it to some extent, and then beyond that, I may just refer you back to individuals in those companies who can better speak to their products and their methodologies. But the big picture I would like to convey today is that as far as ESG is concerned, Moody's has, if you will, two different components of Moody's ESG efforts. The one that I speak to is within the rating agency, and it only focuses on ESG integration into credit and credit ratings. And another is a business called Moody's ESG Solutions. That's much more broad-based, and that provides a wide variety of services to fixed income investors, but also to equity investors, to index providers, more broadly to the market, to other stakeholders that go beyond just debt and equity investors. And that ESG solutions business is much more closely integrated with Vigeo Iris, with 427, and also with Moody's Analytics. And Moody's Analytics, for example, provides stress testing scenarios for banks and so on. And they use data from Vigeo Iris and 427 in doing so. So I would like to highlight that two different distinct ESG businesses within Moody's. And with that, what I will do is spend a little time talking about the credit rating agency and what we do there, and how and how we incorporate ESG into our ratings. So this slide essentially shows you the four key components of how we integrate ESG into credit ratings. I will briefly walk through each one of them, and then maybe I'll see if there are specific questions related to this. And Siobhan, if there are questions related to this particular slide, I'm happy if you want to sort of step in as well. So starting from the top right, ESG classification is essentially the Moody's answer to the question, what is ESG? We realize that oftentimes ESG means different things to different people. The focus can be different as well. So we have defined what is our classification of risks that we believe are more often than not material to credit quality. And that's what you see on this slide here. Now, we don't claim that this classification is exhaustive. It does not cover every single conceivable environmental, social risk that might exist, for example. But what we do believe is that it does capture the most important categories of E and S risks that can affect credit quality. And you see them listed here as well. Environmental, for example, climate change falls into two different categories, physical and carbon transition. But we also have water, waste and pollution, and natural capital, and so on. What you see as private sector and public sector for social and governance is essentially intended to distinguish between governments on the one hand and the private sector on the other hand. So when my colleague Gabriel speaks to sovereign ratings and sovereign scores, he will be more referring to the public sector side of the classification that you see here. And maybe when I speak, I may more often refer to the private sector side of the classification, which speaks to corporations more broadly, but also financial institutions and so on. So we looked at the ESG classification. Coming to the bottom right, the next is heat maps, what we call heat maps. And heat maps are essentially the answer to the question, is ESG material to credit quality? And that is oftentimes the million-dollar question, if you will, as far as ESG goes, which is, when is it material? What, the materiality is a big, is a big topic. The European Union, for example, is talking about dual materiality, where they're focused on not just financial materiality to the issuer, or to the company, but also materiality from the perspective of other broader stakeholders. And so there's clearly two ways of looking at it. And what we look at as a rating agency, our role is to see when ESG issues can affect the company and the company's credit quality. So we have that particular focus on materiality. And what we have done is we have published two heat maps, one for E, environmental, and one for social risks, such that for every element of the classification that you saw here, so you can take any given sector, say oil and gas, utilities, or telecom. It could be any sector that an investor might be looking at, and we have published which of these 15 categories, 5 each in E, S, and G, are in a simple traffic light system, red, orange, yellow, or blue for that particular sector. That is something, it's another step in the transparency where we talk about the sector level and we say which issues do we think are generally important for this sector. And that's what the heat maps tell you. And coming to ESG scores at the bottom left, the ESG scores take this one level further down from the sector level to the issuer level. And so at the issuer level, how is a particular issuer exposed to the risks or to the benefits of ESG issues? Importantly, how is management preparing to adapt to or mitigate some of these risks that exist? And that is something these ESG scores will speak to. I'll describe in more detail the two kinds of scores. The issuer profile scores, they speak to how E, S, or G issues could be material to a particular issuer. And then finally, integration of all of this into credit. We take this understanding of ESG issues into our analysis, and we arrive at a rating. And after having arrived at a rating, we want to answer the question, well, did ESG make a difference to the rating? Is the rating any different because of ESG issues? And if so, that is expressed by means of what we call a credit impact score. And in addition to that, we also have a standalone section called ESG considerations in all our credit opinions to speak about that impact in more detail. So those are broadly the four components. Let me stop here. Shawan, let me know if you see any questions. I can look up the chat box as well, but if you see any, I'm happy to address big picture questions before I jump into the specifics of the scores.
Certainly, and we have a handful coming in, so thanks everyone for being such an active attendee so far. One thing that a few folks have already asked is, what percentage of the ESG score is based on information where companies will be able to provide input versus publicly available information? So how are you going about the data collection process, and will issuers have an opportunity to provide additional or confidential information to support the analysis?
So absolutely, that's a critical part of what we do. So issuers will have the ability to provide us additional information that is otherwise non-public, and we will maintain the confidentiality of such information, as we always do as a rating agency. And so broadly speaking, yes, we rely on companies' public disclosures. We rely on third-party subscription data as well, to the extent that is available and relevant. And we rely on issuer information as well as part of these scores. So those are some of the details that I hope to get into further when we talk about the process for arriving at these scores.
Well, maybe a quick follow-up to that is, you mentioned that you're going to be rolling these out through 2021. Can you give folks on the line a sense of the coverage, the number of issuers that you hope to cover by the end of the year?
I don't know that I can commit to a number by the end of the year, but what I can say two things. One is in terms of what would follow. What would follow would be a number of sectors that broadly belong to the non-financial corporate world, as well as the U.S. municipal finance market, which is public finance, U.S. states, cities, counties, and so on. For both of these two sectors, we have published a request for comment, giving a little more detail about specifically how we apply our framework to non-financial corporates and to U.S. public finance. And so clearly, those are going to be the next to sectors that we add. I can say that eventually also, when we finish rolling out this process, our intent is to have ESG scores to all ratings that Moody's issues. So that is essentially everybody, and that's thousands of scores and ratings. So anything that has a Moody's credit rating will also have an ESG score. That's where we are ultimately going, but I don't have a precise number for 2021.
Thanks, Swami. Maybe one more question, and I know you have some more content to walk through before we turn things over to Gabriel, and we'll take another pause before we turn to his presentation. Can you let us know, how do the ESG considerations map to SASB sectoral frameworks? I know there's a lot going on with SASB, also with SBTI and their net zero criteria. People are wondering how these are all going to feed within your scores.
Okay, so SASB are sort of a disclosure standard, right? It's a disclosure metric. We welcome companies that want to disclose according to SASB standards. What you saw here as an ESG classification is not really a disclosure standard. We are not really telling companies what to disclose under each of these risks. We are simply telling companies these are the most important risks, generally risk categories that we think are material and relevant to credit quality. Of course, different risks for different sectors, the importance varies, and we have identified which of these risks are important as well, but we are not telling companies exactly what we would like to see disclosed. We leave that to standard setting bodies like SASB, TCFD, and GRI and others, but we welcome the evolution towards a more global standard for disclosure.
Thanks, Swami. I know I said that was my last question, but I think we're on a roll here, and I appreciate everyone's questions. There's one that's just talking about, there's dozens of rating agencies that are coming into the market. And we've heard today and throughout the Ceres conference so far is the need for harmonized systems. So everyone's talking the same language and the same metrics. So can you let us know, how is Moody's aligning with other rating agencies, and how are you playing amongst those other groups?
Okay, so maybe I can give a somewhat more detailed answer to that after I introduce specifically what our scores are. I will have to say, though, as an initial response, that we are not necessarily trying to coordinate with other agencies in the market. What we have tried to do is come up with scores that we think squarely address investors' concern around financial materiality of ESG scores and whether these are really relevant. So what we've tried to say is our scores directly speak to impact on credit, which necessarily means they may not speak to other issues that may be important to investors and issuers, about companies doing X or Y in and of itself being good or bad. The EU taxonomy has a whole taxonomy of what is green and what is brown and so on. And we have, former Governor Mark Carney talking about 50 shades of green and so on. So our approach is not necessarily to talk about what is good, bad, green, non-green, but rather simply about whether the issues facing a particular sector we think are going to affect the credit rating of the company. That's the focus that we have. And we think there's value in that. We recognize that may be different from the focus that other score providers and agencies might have. But ultimately, we have to leave it to the market to decide if they find which perspective they find useful. Maybe there's use in both. We think our perspective is very relevant to all kinds of investors because it really speaks to financial materiality of ESG issues.
Thanks, Swami. I'll leave it at that for there, let you run through a few more slides, and then we can open up for some additional Q&A.
Thank you, Showan. I think that's a great place to move into our scores and what these scores mean and how we go about producing these scores. So this chart is it's a little busy, but it sort of lays out the key components of how all the different pieces of the puzzle fit together in coming up with the final output. So I will start with this box on the top right, which speaks to sector-specific methodologies. Many of you are hopefully familiar with this. It deals with rating methodologies. We have one for every sector that we rate. We have one for sovereigns, that Gabriel will speak to. But we have one for utilities, for automakers, for publishing and media, telecom, and so on. Every sector has a specific rating methodology. Ultimately, if a rating has to change, that change has to happen through the rating methodology. And so the rating methodology often has a number of factors. Some of these factors may look directly, like ESG issues, but other times they may not necessarily directly look like an ESG issue. But ESG issues can affect these considerations. For example, just to throw out one example for illustration, if you look at our auto manufacturer methodology, there is a factor called market position and product strength. And that is a generic that obviously people can understand why that matters to credit, because it speaks to market share, it speaks to brand recognition, quality, service, the kind of cars make, the product mix. All of these are obviously important to credit. But incorporated in there are also many ESG considerations, because when you talk about product mix, it's also about whether they have a credible strategy to make electric cars, or whether they are making all SUVs or smaller cars that are more fuel efficient, and so on. So while the rating methodologies may not explicitly talk about environmental friendliness of products, for example, the environmental friendliness of products feeds into our assessment of these factors, and similarly other ESG issues. So what we thought would be very important is we keep our methodology, but we want a separate way to illustrate what view of ESG risks facing a particular company is incorporated into our analysis. And that's where the ESG cross-sector methodology and the profile scores come in. And as you see in the bottom half, you see there are 5 scores, 5 categories of E, S, and G, E1 to E5, S1 to S5, G1 to G5. They reflect what we think about each of these 15 categories of risk that you see below. In fact, what we intend to publish is not just a score of E1 or E4, but in fact, a 1 to 5 score for each of the 5 categories under environment as well. So a 1 to 5 score for carbon, a 1 to 5 score for physical, a 1 to 5 score for water, and so on. So in effect, our output will be 19 different scores that go with every single issuer. 15 of them will speak to each of these 15 categories of risk. And then there would be 3 profile scores for E, S, and G, and then finally a credit impact score. So these profile scores reflect our view of the ESG risks and benefits facing a particular issuer that is then incorporated through the rating methodology in coming up with the rating, right? And then once we come up with the rating, the question is, okay, did it make a difference? Did ESG considerations make a difference to the rating or not, right? And most people want that answer. That's perhaps the most frequently asked question of us rating agencies. And so this score, the credit impact score, is specifically defined to reflect that. So if you have a credit impact score of 1, positive, what it means is the rating of this company is higher than it would have been in the absence of ESG considerations. So the rating is actually different. So we will be explicitly stating that this company is rated higher than it would otherwise be because it has some very financially material ESG strengths to go with it. That might be a renewable energy producer or an electric car maker or any company well positioned to capitalize on various ESG trends. Neutral is, as simple name implies, that ESG considerations are not really material to this issuer. The rating, there's not much impact on the rating. 3 is a moderately negative, which means ESG considerations are a negative influence, but they're not yet changing the rating. It's a negative influence that is built in, but there's no change to the rating itself at this point. 4 is an actual negative. The rating is actually lower than it would be in the absence of ESG considerations. And 5 is where the rating is substantially lower than it would be in the absence of ESG considerations. An obvious example of CIS 5 would probably be coal miners, and there are certain others. We will be publishing more of these scores, and Gabriel will speak to some sovereigns which have a CIS 5. But the point I would like to leave you with is you are getting two things from these scores. Not only the risks and opportunities that a particular company faces, but also a clear statement, a very transparent statement as to whether ESG issues actually made a difference to the rating. And together, we think it gives a full picture of ESG issues. What does it give investors or anybody interested in ESG analysis? It gives 2 or 3 different things. First, where people are interested in general screening or simply understanding, tilting their portfolios to avoid certain risks or and so on, the 15 scores for each of the categories allow you to do so. It may be a simple screening, it may be other more sophisticated forms of ESG integration, but you can specifically look for high, low, or neutral risks on all of these 15 risk categories. Secondly, as I said, it clearly tells you whether the rating has been affected by ESG issues. And thirdly, this is a little more it's a little more subtle, but what it does tell you is if you have an issuer with an E5 score, for example, high risk environmental profile, that could coexist with a CIS2, a neutral to low impact on the rating. What it tells you is this issuer has very high exposure to ESG risks or E risks, but those risks have not, or maybe a 3, let's say a 2 or a 3, but those risks haven't yet actually affected the credit rating. So it speaks to the potential for future impact on the rating. And why it doesn't affect the rating today is something that you will find an explanation for in our credit opinions. But the fact that there is that difference tells you there is a potential impact in the future. So there's a lot I've talked about on this slide. So I want to stop here again and take questions, Shovan, if there are on the definitions of these scores.
Yeah, certainly, Swami, and lots of questions are coming in. So let me just kick things off. So in the 15 categories of risk across E, S, and G, are all of them weighted the same, or do you weigh some more than others?
Okay, maybe I will answer that with reference to my next slide. So our idea, one of the things we think, the value we think we really bring to this whole process is an analyst judgment. What we are not trying to do here is to use dozens of data points or hundreds of data points, map them all to various risks, assign some weights to them, come up with a weighted average score, and say that's the ESG issue. We don't want to take that approach. Rather, what we want to do is we want to look for data and metrics that are highly relevant and material to the risk being discussed. And then 2, bring in the judgment of the analysts to answer that question as to where the score is and how, rather than come up with a mathematical weighting. So, for example, if you look at the environmental risks on this slide, we combine the 5 environmental categories into one issuer profile score. But we don't necessarily have a weight. For example, a company could have a very high risk on carbon transition. But let's say water management is not a big risk for the sector. Water is a low risk. A weighting might move the score to something close to an average risk, which we don't really think is the right answer. The right answer is that it is high risk because carbon transition is high risk and can really affect the rating of the company, even though water or other risks might be low. So we tend to go towards the highest risk. We tend to focus on the highest risk that exists among these 5, because these risks are independent and any one of them by themselves can potentially affect the credit of the company. So we tend to focus on the highest risk, but we also tend to incorporate any plans that a management may have to reduce, mitigate, or avoid these risks in the future, either by realigning the business model or by making investments in products and services that have a better environmental profile and so on. So we want to incorporate those, the analyst judgment, the understanding of the industry and the company that we bring in, and then come up with an overall score that is based on judgment rather than on a weight that is assigned to each factor.
Thanks, Swami. One question that's coming in that I really appreciate is linked to time horizons and materiality. So I think we heard it in some remarks at another point of the Ceres conference, but decades ago, the things that are coming up at Ceres 2021 were not on a lot of business leaders' agendas. So how will Moody's be able to identify severe problems that need to be identified early from a social and financial standpoint, but which are maybe not widely accepted as having a material impact until much later? How are you building in those into your models right now of long-term material risks?
So all long-term risks will be reflected in our issuer profile scores here that you see. So for example, physical climate risks, maybe the actual impact we are talking about of sea level rise or of temperature changes and hurricanes and so on. And well, hurricanes we can see now, but many physical impacts may not be visible maybe for decades. What we intend to do is to highlight those risks, even where those risks may be very long-term in nature. So we would score physical climate risk a 4 or a 5 if a particular issuer is highly exposed to those issues, even though they may not be financially material today and maybe longer-term risks. And that's why I said in the previous slide, it is possible that there is a difference between what the IPS score indicates and what the CIS indicates. So to your point, Shawan, where if you have a long-term risk, and yes, it is true that very long-term risks may not affect the credit rating today, may not change the credit rating today, you might have situations where you have an environmental profile score of a 4 or a 5 coexisting with a 2 or a 3 credit impact score, indicating that the rating today isn't yet affected but by what we have flagged as a high environmental risk. But that discrepancy, that difference in scores gives you an indication of the potential for negative impact on the rating if those risks were to materialize and the company or debt issuer is not able to do enough to manage those risks.
Thanks, Swami. Maybe 2 more questions, and then I'm looking at the clock, and we can think about some transitions over to Gabriel and just allow for more of a free flow for the rest of today's conversation through 3:30 Eastern time. But I know this year we have a strong climate justice and equity track at our Ceres conference, and one of our participants who's tuning in is surprised that human rights aren't listed as a risk category. And is that considered part of responsible production? How does that fall within the S pillar?
Absolutely. Human rights are a part of responsible production. Responsible production covers a wide range of issues, including all kinds of supply chain related issues. So human rights would definitely fall in there. And human capital, which deals with the employees and contractors of the company itself, potentially human rights issues could fall in there, especially for companies that have an employee base in so many countries around the world.
And Swami, what's the frequency in which you expect to review these scores? I know that I've had a chance to talk to you and get a sense of the larger ESG team you work with, but what's the frequency in which these will be updated and that some issuers can interface with you all throughout the months to come?
It actually reminds me, Shawan, of one important point that I failed to make, which is that these scores are produced by the same team of analysts that produce credit ratings. So my team, the ESG team, we act as experts. We are available for discussions with issuers. We participate in rating committees to give our perspectives on these issues. We have come up with this framework to guide analysts in applying them, but we don't come up with the scores ourselves. We think the people who know the companies best are best positioned to come up with these scores. And so if you think about how often these scores are revisited, it is about the same answer as how often credit ratings are revisited. I think as a general rule, very often, at least once a year, you tend to have something on credit ratings, a credit opinion being updated, and so on. You should think of this similarly. Anytime, so it is roughly like that, or as often as necessary. Think of them as they go along with credit ratings. And if there is an ESG development in the market, that could have rating implications, we have to go to the rating committee, discuss the rating implications, potentially change the ESG scores as well, and publish all of them together. So it is integral to how we do ratings at Moody's.
Thanks, Swami. Maybe one more question for you. Would companies get lower ESG scores if they don't disclose ESG metrics at all compared to those that do? And can issuers decline to be scored?
Okay, great questions. By and large, as a general rule, we are not scoring to disclosure. So we will not be penalizing companies for not disclosing about their carbon operations, emissions, or any other aspect of ESG risk. We think the value we bring is in analyzing the materiality. So a low risk company may not be disclosing anything whatsoever on ESG, and that's fine by us because they are low risk, and we will not, on the other hand, a high risk company may be disclosing a lot and still get a poor ESG score from us because they are high risk. And so we are looking at the underlying economic impact. We also recognize as rating agencies, we are privileged enough to have access to management and potentially access to non-public information. So we are always able to, should we need it, to have additional discussions to get the information we would like to have for our scores. Siobhan, I forget the second question that you had.
Yeah.
One was disclosure.
Yeah, the second part of that is, can issuers decline to be rated?
Oh, no. These ratings are part of our process to come up with credit ratings. These scores are part of the process to come up with credit ratings. So they get assigned automatically. Obviously, we haven't scored a lot of issuers yet. We're going to be scoring them over time. But as a general rule, issuers do not get to pick and choose whether or not they get ESG scores. Well,
thanks, Swami. And I'm sure that folks are now starting to think about what this means for where they sit within the markets. I'm looking at the time, so it's 3:09. We have about 20 more minutes. I know Gabriel has some content that he wants to share. So I don't know if it makes sense for you, Swami, to turn things over to Gabriel. Gabriel, maybe you can walk us through what this means for sovereign ESG credit ratings. And there's a lot of content within this next part of the deck that I bet will interest those who are tuning in. So Gabriel, turning things over to you, and Han, if you don't mind spotlighting him.
Sure. So I think one of the points that Swami did not have a chance to go through is the actual scale that we use. And that actual scale is a 5-point scale and color-coded.
Do you want me to go to the scale, Gabriel?
Maybe quickly, so that, because it will lay the groundwork for the rest. Yeah, why not?
Do you see the slide here?
Yes.
Go ahead. Why don't you go through it? Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So basically, my point was this: we created, as Swami pointed out, we have this general methodology for across all of Moody's, and this methodology's approach will rely on us applying scores. So what are these scores? Well, the scores are positive, neutral, or negative, right? And as you can see, they tend to be more negative. There are more negative options than there are positive options. There's only one positive option, because as a general rule, we believe that ESG risks are risk more than they are opportunities. There are some exceptions, and I'll go through them in the case of sovereign. But this is sort of what we use. And I just wanted to sort of highlight this point. Maybe we can go back now to slide 15. With that in mind, with this scale that we use, first of all, let me very briefly explain how did we reach these scores. So there's a couple of ways for sovereigns, right? This is what I'm focusing on today. We have a bottom-up approach that is based on quantitative scores. So, for example, in social, you may remember from one of the earlier slides, one of the categories within social was health and safety. What are indicators of health and safety? Well, we looked at a variety of them. But some of them that we looked are life expectancy, and others are the homicide rate. So these are indicators that are in global databases that are comparable across countries, available for most, not always all the countries we cover. And for each of these categories, we looked for those indicators that best captured the risk we were trying to measure here. We did not weight them in a specific fashion. We did not add them up into a combined score, as, for example, we do in our sovereign methodology. So if you look at a sovereign risk and you look at a country and you gave me, for example, their debt to GDP and their interest payments to revenue and a few other indicators, I could tell you based on our methodology what that meant in terms of the risk we had. But we did not create this for these social or environmental indicators because we did not feel that the data was there for the risk. And also because, and here comes the other way we look at it, we also include what I would call a top-down approach. And this is the qualitative assessment that we make of the risk based on the definitions that we have provided from our knowledge of these countries. One way we determine this is, for example, if we were looking at exposure to physical climate risk, obviously, in principle, a small Caribbean island will be more affected than, Central American country, but which in turn will be more affected than, say, the United States. And one way we looked at it was how many times have we, in the course of our rating committees in the past, or in the course of reports we have written, mentioned these as risks. Because I think one important point to make here is throughout this whole, us making public and producing all these scores is what we are doing is we are making explicit that which we believe was already implicit. That is, we're not making any changes to our ratings. As a consequence of our environmental risk, we're not saying, oh, we did not realize that there was a risk in social, for example. Rather, before it was part of our analysis. So if you read, as an example, our assessments in Chile throughout the last couple of years with all the protests, social issues were prevalent and across, something we mentioned consistently. If you looked at governance, one example that we'll have here in Argentina, we've been talking about that for many years. But now we have scores that we can utilize, that we can use to compare. So what you see here is the distribution. You can see that this is of all the 144 countries that we currently cover across the world. Some quick takeaways from this: we have no countries with a positive environmental score. So at this point, doesn't mean that we can't. We could in the future if things change. But right now, we don't see any country where it's a positive. And in fact, positive scores are not that many. The one exception is governance. And I should point out that in the case of governance, we have E, S, and G. E and S for sovereigns, we have treated differently than G. Why? Because governance, we already had scores before we came to the ESG. That is, our sovereign methodology, one of the factors it has 4 big factors. One of them is institutions and governance. So the governance issuer profile scores is mapping from that methodology. And we have some countries that we believe have very strong governance. For environmental and social, we created this or assigned these scores for the first time, and they're not mapped from prior scores. They are the result, as I said, of a combination of quantitative and qualitative. If you look at the next slide, you have the same distribution. Wait for a second for it to go through. But you'll see that you'll the same distribution of the scores, except that it's for, tell me if you want, I can change. Just double checking.
Yes, Swami, do you mind advancing to the next slide if we still have you? Wonderful, thanks.
Slide 16, yeah. So what you can see here is it's the same distribution, except that now we're dividing between advanced and emerging. And one of the points that Swami had made about all these different sectors, in the sovereign world, we only have 2 sectors. We have advanced economies and we have emerging markets. And you can see, just briefly looking at the colors, the negatives are the combination of yellow, orange, and red. And you can see most of emerging markets have some degree of negative scores, whereas in advanced economies, negatives tend to be less. Practically all the countries have a positive governance, and neutral to low seems to be the main or one of the biggest scorings that we have provided in advanced economies. And to some extent, what this reflects is that advanced economy, I mean, there's more than one way of defining them, but one quick way of thinking of them separate from emerging markets is that they tend to be richer and therefore have more resources to deal with these shocks. So social demands in a country like the US, it's not that people demand less or more than a country, say, like Bolivia, but the US has the ability to provide more, and therefore the social pressures might be weakened, maybe less. So protest, it's not that the US is not social pressures or protests, but there's a varying degree of the eventual impact or exposure it means. Similar thing with environmental, you know, the richer you are, the better positioned you are to deal with it. So as you can see, governance is the only among emerging markets score within these 4 scores, meaning the credit impacts and the 3 of ESG that has anything positive. All the rest are varying degrees of negatives and some neutral to low. And then I can point out to the big difference. Sorry.
Yeah, Gabriel, do you want to quickly pause for a few questions that are
I
coming
am, yes, by all means, yes.
So for the E pillar, do you take into account whether a country meets CO2 emission targets?
The short answer is no. Why not? Because and I think this might be a difference between the way sovereigns work and corporates. For the time being, we're not incorporating directly in sovereigns what you would call reputational risk, right? And that's because for the time being, the markets have not penalized them. So that may change. But a country that does not meet, or a country that does more than it needs to and meets CO2 emission targets may be providing a benefit to itself over a long period of time and to the world as a whole, but it does not necessarily improve its capacity to fund itself, which ultimately is what we're trying to capture here. Mm-hmm. A company, and Swami can probably provide more details on that, can wake up tomorrow to find that there's a factory that had some environmental issue that has a huge immediate and direct impact on their equity, on their stock price, as well as their capacity to fund itself. That doesn't really apply to sovereigns directly. So we look at more the exposure they have to the environmental risk, whether somehow the environmental risk is one, again, typical example of a Caribbean island, physical climate risk, but within environmental, we include others. Carbon transition, for example, which is a huge issue for some oil producers.
Thanks, Gabriel. Maybe building off that question, there's one coming in that says, given the overall discussion during the Ceres conference on the urgency to act and the need for public policy, which I know we're seeing quite a swing here in the States right now, the environmental scores are alarming for this person. Do you think the integration of E into sovereign credit rating will help to incentivize governments to act and accelerate their efforts on environmental issues?
Well, I mentioned in the answer to the prior question that we were not looking directly at these reputational risks. But having said that, in our discussions with governments, we have received very much a question similar to this, meaning, do we need to act more? What should we do? How do we interpret your scores? Are you telling us that we need to, result X, Y, and Z? My sense is that the community, the financial community as a whole, including in this the issuers, in this case the sovereigns, us, investors and so forth, are all looking for answers. It's not yet clear. Based on my talks with both investors and with issuers, governments across the world, I think they are only now beginning to understand, okay, we're going to be judged on this, we're going to be scored on this, and we will be able to compare. So it might take a while for this. I suspect that the answer that I can give today, which is I don't know, might be very different if we ask the same question a few years from now, as we advance more, and this becomes more, this and other versions, of how we look at ESG scores in the financial community become more ingrained and more common.
Mm-hmm. Well, like you, I hope this is promising information that does get people to the table and to act a little bit more with urgency. Maybe one quick question, then we can go back to your slides. In your methodology, do frontier countries and markets fall under emerging economies?
They would, yes. We have a definition, and I to be honest, I can't recall. It might have been from the IMF, where we took the advanced economies. For example, a couple of islands, Cayman and Bermuda, which are very rich, still fall in their emerging markets right now. But definitely what you would consider frontier markets would be considered emerging markets in this distribution.
Thanks, Gabriel. So maybe I'll hand things over to you for a few more minutes, and then we can open up with some final questions and then let people go for the rest of the day. But Gabriel, I know you have some more content to cover with us, so please dig in.
Yeah. So I mean, very quickly, this graph is meant to, this one is meant to show the relationship between the ratings and the credit impact scores we have actually assigned, right? And as mentioned, we in the sovereign team are the first ones to assign. Other groups will follow, and we'll see how it shows, but I suspect something similar. And what this is telling you is that there's a correlation, but it's not perfectly linear. That means that, yes, the higher rated countries tend to have credit impact scores that are either less negative or more positive, up higher, improvement in the scale. But that, if you look at this scale, for example, a country with a BA2 rating at the time we assigned this could have as low as a 5 in the credit impact score to as high as a 2, meaning neutral to low. So there's there's a lot of variation that can happen with a given rating, but generally speaking, the higher the rating, the better will be the credit impact score. The next 3 slides, I'll just go quickly. I don't want to take too much time, and I think you will be sharing them, but these are just examples. In this case, for example, for environmental, of each of the, as Swami mentioned, we have not only produced scores for credit impact score and for environmental, social, and governance scores, but also for each of the categories. Environmental, for example, carbon transition, you can see very highly negative a country like Oman, oil exporter, depends on this. And in our view, Austria is an example of neutral to low. Natural capital, New Zealand. I'm always happy to, for those that care about the Lord of the Rings, where they filmed. So Middle Earth is safe in natural capital. And the Solomon Islands, much more at risk. So these are just examples of the variation of the scores. For social, the same point. The only thing I would highlight is that if you looked at the environmental and at the social, practically all the worst scores, meaning the 4s or the 5s, are emerging markets. The one exception to this are demographics, where it's the only one where advanced economies have a worse scores, and that's because they're older societies that have a large welfare states that has fiscal and economic impacts of an aging society. Ireland, one of the few examples of a positive on demographics. And then finally, maybe just given the time, a few examples. If you look on slide, governance, I'll just jump to Argentina, but on governance, I think the point here is simply that we are mapping this from our scores in the methodology. So we have scores there that we've mapped to the 1 to 5 scale. The one exception is transparency and disclosure, where we don't have a direct mapping and we have voted directly into the 1 to 5. But again, each of the sovereigns that we cover has a score for every one of them. And now if you look at the next one, Argentina, just as one example, you can see that in the score we assigned, they have moderately negative for social and environmental. This is a country where some might be surprised, if you will, that social is just a 3 given protests and so forth. But in our view, they have, despite all these problems, they have managed that. It's part of the background noise, if you will. And environmental is one of the reflections of the risk that a commodity producer, that the agricultural commodity producer, is at risk of drought. But the biggest issue is governance. And in this particular case, governance is really what drives not just the worst score, but also ultimately the credit impact score. And if you look at our reports, we have mentioned governance many times in the past as a driver of the Argentina's very low rating. The next slide is another example, this case of South Africa. You can see in this case, it's the social that drives the score for the credit, the ultimate credit impact score of highly negative. Again, environmental and also somewhat negative. Governance, in our view, is relatively stronger, and sometimes the governance might include things as the management of the macro policy, macroeconomics, environment, inflation, and on the fiscal side. So that might be reflecting some of these compared to the improved scores. And then the last example I have here on the next slide is an example of something that is more positive. And Sweden is among the few countries, I believe there's only 10 or so out of the 144, where the overall ESG is a positive to the rating. And you can see that it reflects positive scores, in particular on governance and social. So that's how we look at the scores, how we combine quantitative and qualitative assessments into a final score, and some of the scores that we have signed. And for those interested, you can reach out. We can share with you some of the scores if you care to have them.
Yeah, thanks, Gabriel. So I think we're at a natural pause right now where we could do a couple more Q&A that's coming in. And thank you, everyone. This is a very talkative group. One question I might ask the both of you, are country-specific SDG data and progress taken into account to inform credit opinion and ratings from a historical perspective? Is that something, Swami or Gabriel, you would like to answer?
I'll leave Gabriel to give more color, but I would say SDG would be similar to the question on Paris commitments. I don't know that SDGs themselves necessarily directly speak to sovereign ratings, but Gabriel, you may want to add something more there.
No, I agree. I mean, we look at the exposure. In fact, most of the data we try to look at is the more recent. One thing we didn't really get a chance to look at here, but one question that we received in the past has to do with outlooks on ESG scores, meaning how do we think about them going forward, which is, in the case of credits ratings we have, that at the end of the day, for us, any score has to reflect the risk of what we measure, which is the ability to pay the debt, right? So that's kind of really what we're focusing on.
Thanks. Another question that ties into this second portion is, can you give us a little more insight into how you're getting your compliance and reporting ratings? So how does compliance to environmental permits, both domestically, but also internationally, and I know there's a lot of range in that, factor into the governance score?
How do we what? Compliance.
Yeah. Can you give a little bit more insight into how you're getting your compliance and reporting ratings?
So I'm not sure exactly whether that question is meant for sovereigns, for corporates. Compliance and reporting is if I may skip a few slides here, is a governance category, but for corporates, not necessarily for governance. For governments, we have institutional structure, policy credibility, budget management, and transparency. Compliance is an issue for corporates where we look at transparency of financial reporting, timeliness of reporting, compliance with laws and regulations, lawsuits around non-compliance with environmental laws or other laws, bribery and corruption would fall under there, so on and so forth. I don't know if that's the question that the gentleman or the questioner wanted to ask, but it's not something that's relevant to sovereigns.
Well, looking at the clock, and I know we just have a minute or so left, there's been a lot of attendees on today's line, so thank you very much. Many questions coming in if this is going to be recorded and sent back into your inboxes. I think seeing some nods from Swami and Gabriel, that's something that we can aim to follow up with some more intel. But maybe with that in mind, Gabriel, do you mind helping us close and with this last question of how can attendees, so we have investors on the line, companies, a big range of capital market players, can they still provide input? I know you've had a couple open comment periods to date. Ceres has provided some commentary to you all as a team, but how can they stay involved and what should they expect on the horizon?
I mean, I think in general, yes, we have, as Swami pointed out, we have requests for comments on two other areas. We started with sovereign. We have them for corporates and for local governments. I suspect we'll continue having more of those over time. We will possibly in the future review even for sovereigns themselves, as we look at this. The methodology in sovereign that has more of a history than ESG is regularly updated. So we are constantly looking for feedback from the market as to how best capture the risk that we're trying to capture, right? As we tweak the indicators we use, the definitions and so forth. I don't know, Swami, if you have something else on that.
No, I think we welcome comments. The comment period for corporates and local governments is open through Friday, which I know it's not much longer. But we certainly welcome interaction, ongoing interaction with issuers and investors on this topic.
Wonderful. Well, with that being said, I want to thank you for your time and insights today, Swami and Gabriel. I know we've been having a lot of Q&A with our participants. We'll stay tuned in the months to come on all this important work. And for all of you who are joining us for the Ceres 2021 conference this week, we look forward to seeing you tomorrow bright and early. So take care, be well, enjoy your evenings, and we'll be in touch.